Hey, everybody. Welcome to the latest edition of Accented Dialogues in Diaspora. I'm Viet Thanh Nguyen, here with my co-host, Philip Nguyen. Philip, how are you doing?
I'm hanging in there. I'm feeling pretty autumn-y.
Good, me too. We're here on Accented, and on this show, we talk with fabulous guests whose work centers on the Southeast Asian diaspora. Today, our guest is the debut novelist, Carolyn Huynh. She writes about Vietnamese American identity, diasporic witches of the West Coast, and tall tales her mother would tell her in a humorous way. Her debut novel, The Fortunes of Jaded Women, came out in September 2022 from Atria Books, Simon and Schuster. The Fortunes of Jaded Women is an intergenerational story of family dysfunction, complete with hot gossip, messy matchmaking, and unconditional love. Ever since their ancestor Nguyen left her husband for another man, the young women have been cursed to be unlucky in love and only give birth to daughters. Sisters Mai, Min, and Nguyen haven't spoken to one another or to their mother for the last 10 years. The sisters' relationships with their own daughters are hardly any better. All this changes when Mai visits her trusted psychic advisor and is rocked by the revelation that this will be the year her family experiences a marriage, a funeral, and the birth of a son. But Mai is warned that if she isn't careful, it will also be the year she loses everything. Carolyn Huynh, welcome to Accented.
Thank you for that intro.
In the green room, we were talking about our vast age difference between myself and you and Philip. You are of a different generation than me, but I think it's fabulous, that part of what we do on the show, but also that what Diasporic Vietnamese Artist Network does is to talk about the need for a younger generation of creative people doing creative and interesting things about their lives, about their backgrounds, and about the Southeast Asian diaspora. And certainly you, Carolyn, fit that bill with your first novel, Fortunes of Jaded Women. Now, you grew up in Orange County, specifically Santa Ana in California, where your book is set. What was it like to write about this community?
It's funny. I hated growing up in Santa Ana as a child, right? And when I left for almost 10 years, I really began to miss the idea of home. And I really just wanted to bring to light, my childhood, the places that I went to. And it's actually quite contemporary, but I don't think people really see Little Saigon as like contemporary, right? And so that's why I really want to center that area and showcase a very contemporary setting of all these women, so chaotic and so messy, just like navigating their love lives.
All right.
Yeah, thanks for that, Carolyn. And I think, in the green room, we were talking about what do we call Anh Viet, right? Is it Anh Viet or Du Viet or just Professor Viet? And I think it's really interesting too, because now, Carolyn, with this book, right, you enter the world of Vietnamese American literature, and it's among the Ans and the Jus and the G goals that are already out there, right? Mm-hmm. And I'm sure, we know that your book is funny. There are a lot of folks that are yet to read it. So if you haven't read it yet, just know that it's funny and it showcases Vietnamese humor, right? But I also wanted to ask you, where is it do you get your own sense of humor, especially, or if it is at all shaped by how you grew up in the Orange County?
I never really saw myself as funny, but I think when I wrote this, it came from a place of extreme trauma. And I think trauma can breed really funny people. And so I think I was actually quite surprised. But actually, my mom is also very, she's quite unintentionally funny. I think most Vietnamese mothers are unintentionally funny. And so that's sort of where I drew that inspiration from. But also, I don't know an unfunny Vietnamese person. Does that make sense? I feel like everybody knows how to drag and roast each other. I think that's where the love comes from. And it's sort of thickened my skin for I can go read a bad review about my book and it's kind of goes off, washes over me, right? Because my parents, my community have roasted me enough. And so I think that's where the funny and the humor stems from. Probably underpressed trauma, to be quite honest. Yeah.
I'd like to introduce you to my parents, who are not funny. Okay. It's like, I've heard about these Vietnamese people who like to tell jokes and roast people and be vulgar and obscene and and do
Yeah.
all funny things. And I grew up in the strict Vietnamese Catholic household that was, yeah, as you've mentioned, traumatized by all the obvious stuff about war and refugee experience and economic struggle and all that. There was no humor. So I'm relieved that there are some Vietnamese people out there who have a sense of humor and who have a good time. Now, in the Vietnamese American literature, which is actually, an incredibly growing field, and we have so many authors working in all kinds of different genres, I wouldn't say that humor or comedy is a feature that most people would note about Vietnamese American literature. And so your book is really interesting in that sense because it foregrounds the comedic aspect and the humor as well. But you mentioned that it comes from the trauma too. So how do you think your novel fits into this larger context of what it is that people perceive of the Vietnamese American or Vietnamese diasporic community that were inevitably shaped by the trauma of war and the refugee experience?
I really wanted to stray away from writing about the Vietnam War, right? Just because I've grown up with it my entire life. But that trauma stems from my parents and how they navigate the world. And back then I'm the second youngest of two daughters, and so I think I just really had to learn how to navigate that myself. And I think that's where the humor stems from. Just sort of it's almost it's like my Linus blanket, right? And it's also another way for my parents to show love. We all have trauma with our parents, and how we relieve that from each other is through humor, at least through my parents. But also, I think the problem stems from your family because your family's Catholic, right? Vietnamese Buddhists are funny. Vietnamese Catholics are scary. Yeah, right? It's a whole different sort of level of humor.
I am not going to dispute that. I think you've opened up a whole new can of worms.
Yeah.
These Catholics, that's like arguing, which pho is better, Northern pho.
Yeah.
And we're gonna have another civil war over this kind of stuff. But we would love to hear you read an excerpt from the Fortunes of Jaded Women, if that's possible.
Yes, I'm gonna read a dialogue between the three mothers, and I think this little bit of dialogue will sort of highlight Orange County, Little Saigon in a really funny way. It's okay. I'll just go ahead and get started. Can we try to be nice, at least for today? Mrs. Pham, the middle sister, pleaded. It's been 10 years. I can if she can, Mrs. Lamb said icily, avoiding her oldest sister's gaze. I'll start if she starts, Mrs. Nguyen shot back, also skirting eye contact. Can we hurry this up? I have things to tend to with my businesses, Mrs. Lamb sniffed. My coffee business is exploding, I don't have much time for the second little reunion or whatever we are calling this. Mrs. Nguyen scoffed. Your coffee business? Come now, Quinn. Unfortunately, we're family. You can be honest with me. You don't need to cover up what it is you actually do. Jai, we serve coffee, believe it or not, Mrs. Lamb hissed, lowering her voice so no one around them could eavesdrop. It just so happens that the uniforms the women wear are different from your regular coffee shops. We're not Starbucks, In fact, we're better. We provide entertainment. You don't actually have your daughters work as one of the girls inside, do you? Mrs. Pham asked, genuinely curious. I'd imagine it's not the most glamorous work, wearing a bikini all day. Of course not. They are in charge of operations. They take care of the women inside, make sure they're safe, Mrs. Lamb snapped. Elaine is basically the mini CEO of the coffee business, and Christine runs the nail salons. You've always had an entrepreneurial spirit. You're willing to take risks no other woman will, Mrs. Pham said admiringly. All that cash, untaxed. Mrs. Nguyen scoffed. Sure, if you want to earn your money as a criminal. Don't you pretend you're above it all. I remember when you used to butcher pigs out in the San Fernando Valley, Mrs. Lamb sniped. At least I'm not a pimp. What did you call me? Mrs. Lamb said, her voice rising.
Oh my gosh. Like claps for the chat and claps in the Zoom. But I mean, Carolyn, I think I feel it, I feel the ladies in the nail salon going bickering back and forth at each other. I mean, speaking about the sort of maybe this delineation between like Vietnamese Catholics and Vietnamese Buddhists and the way that humor is karmic, right? I think that for Vietnamese Buddhists, I also think when the materialism is not supposed to be as emphasized, you kind of get this sense that everything becomes very, very material in terms of like social status and wealth and how the measure of success for each of the children is compared. So how you kind of alluded to that in the excerpt that you read, but can you speak to how or why you think this competitiveness happens in our community, right?
I think it just really stems from like, assimilation, trying to come here with like nothing in your pocket, and it brings your children are your pride and joy, right? And what they produce in the world, that's like part of your name. And I grew up with that type of culture, where my mom is really funny. She's not, I would say she's sort of like, she's definitely not normal, right? In comparison to a lot of Vietnamese mothers. She's actually quite independent, and like, she doesn't want me to get married, doesn't believe in all that stuff. She's always like telling me, like, if you ever do get married, like buy a second house and hide it from your husband, the shit like that, right? Oh, can I say that? Whatever, it's fine. But that bragging culture was so predominant growing up, where like my uncle and my mother and my other cousins would like, and my aunties, like they would just sort of like stab each other with words, be like, oh, she's studying biology. Oh, so stupid. Right? Like, so like, it's like just like little cutting words like that. And also that goes back to like being funny, right? Like, what's wrong with like, you know what I mean? So like, I just think it's like, you don't have anything when you come here that your children's accomplishments like all that you have and you hold on to so tightly and so dearly. And that type of pressure is just exhausting, and it's not sustainable. And the children who have grown up with that culture, we recognize that now as like, it's just not okay. And hopefully like we can sort of like stop that cycle from happening to like our children.
If you are just joining us now, we are Accented, Dialogues in Diaspora. I'm the co-host, Viet Thanh Nguyen, with my other co-host, Philip Nguyen, and today we're talking to debut novelist Carolyn Huynh, who has just published a very funny novel, Fortunes of Jaded Women. Okay, Carolyn, you were talking about these competitive pressures in the Vietnamese refugee and immigrant community. I totally hear what you're talking about. And another dimension of the novel, though, is that the novel is very specifically about Vietnamese women, mothers, daughters, granddaughters, sisters, all these relationships with each other. And part of the energy of the novel is coming around this fact that after this long family curse, there's this prophecy that the next child is going to be a boy, and everybody gets very, very excited about this. Now, I find that really interesting because you were just talking about how your mother is a very independent woman, told you not to get married, which I've actually never heard of before, and I think it's terrific advice. Why center the novel on these tensions between Vietnamese women and then pin all their hopes on a male heir?
It's quite like an archaic, thing, like Vietnamese sons are better than daughters, right? And like obviously that's so traditional and it doesn't really exist. It comes from like the old country, right? That like they like hold so dear, like, oh, my son will inherit everything. And my father had 2 sets of daughters with 2 different women. And I grew up my entire life thinking, oh my God, I'm cursed, right? And I always thought, I was like, what this man is like babbling, right? Like, he's always, I'm so cursed. And like, it's just so archaic to me and like honestly like quite funny, right? And that's why I wanted like this lineage of women to believe that they're cursed, but obviously the curse is just a metaphor. It's not, I don't want to spoil it for people. Or maybe I should. I don't know. I'm not going to spoil it, but it's just like a metaphor for something else, right? And they don't actually want a son. Oh, did I spoil it? Whatever. It's fine. You can cut that out, hopefully. But yeah, so basically it's just the son is just a metaphor in the end. And that's how I grew up thinking my dad was like so literal about, I need a son, but really he didn't care in the end. Like he still doesn't care. It's just something that like he feels like he has to say in like, again, a very roasting way, right? If I do something bad, like, oh God, I wish I had a son. You know what I mean?
Right.
And
right.
so another form of roasting. And it took me a while to like really understand that.
I don't know how many people are watching like House of the Dragon right now, but that first episode is about like this desire to have a son,
Yes.
right? So, I mean, but back to your book though, Carolyn, you know, it is very obviously the focus is on mothers, but do you think it would have, do you think the story would have been different had, if it were about Vietnamese fathers instead of mothers?
Yeah, it's a very different relationship. Actually, my second book is about that father-daughter dynamic, right? But you really, like, even the book, my book alone, my debut, can't even contain everything between like mothers and daughters and like that type of like relationship. It's just so, my mom would always tell me like, this is the hardest relationship she's ever had to, it's so difficult, right? Having that sort of like daughter, you know, because like they pin so much on you when like, you know, they've never really had a voice. My mother never had a voice, and my grandmother, right? And I really wanted to give them and showcase that they do have that voice. And that's why I intentionally really wanted to keep the men separate from it. But I do make allusions to the Vietnamese men in my life. Like, you know, like I have like the Kevin Nguyen, right? Like the gold chain who walk around. I have the Orange County fuckboy who goes from bikini coffee shop to the next bikini coffee shop, right? Like I have these like, and then I have Andy Nguyen, my favorite, Andy, what's his last name? I don't remember the character's name, Andy, right? Andy who falls in love with Twee, right? And they have like that beautiful romantic relationship. So I do have men, but you know, they are quite secondary in the story, but again, very intentional. I just really want to give these women a voice.
Absolutely. I'm sick and tired of hearing about Vietnamese men. Aren't you, Philip? Yeah. And why are they all named like Andy, Kevin, Joe, Tony? Come on. So that was my generation. Everybody.
I think we need more stories that call out the Kevin Nguyen Viet and this hyper toxic Viet masculinity, I will say. You know?
Yeah. I think I've been exposed to that. That the toxic Vietnamese masculinity has been around for a long time. Maybe it's a curse, right?
They're at USC, that's why.
Oh, Kevin Nguyen's at USC.
Yes, the Kevin Nguyen's with the gold chains at USC that go to Arena. I'm just gonna
business majors as my students from Orange County. But you know, talking about toxic masculinity as a curse, there is a curse in your novel. And it's interesting, you know, that you are of a younger generation. You're American born, I assume, right? Yeah, but you know, this idea of curses and intergenerational curses and so on, it's a very Vietnamese kind of thing from the old world, the old country. But in your experience growing up, did you hear a lot about these kinds of old customs and old traditions that seem to be just like from the Vietnam of the past and of your mother's generation? And is that one of the reasons why you wanted to incorporate that into the novel?
I did. Like, you know, hearing like superstitions as a child, I didn't know any better. You grew up here, right? It's not like you can like confirm or deny your friends. Like, is this superstition real? And like, which one, like, what's like, and so for me, like, when my mother would tell me superstitions or curses or whatever, don't do this because of this ghost will get you, or like, don't have a mirror at the end of your bed, or the ghost from the other world will grab your feet and pull you through the mirror, right? Like, that stuff sounds like tall tales. It sounds like bedtime stories because you cannot equate that to the world around you where there's like chicken nuggets and watching Jackie Chan adventures on Saturday morning, right? Like, you just don't know what's real. And so in my mind, I grew up with like a crazy active imagination because of my mother's superstitions, because of everything my mother like brought over. So I don't remember the original question. Actually, what is it?
Like, you know, it's really interesting that you grew up as an American-born, younger Vietnamese American, hearing these kinds of stories and curses and everything like that. I find it very interesting because actually I didn't grow up with that. Like, I don't know anything about Vietnamese ghost stories or anything like that, or Vietnamese curses. My thing was the war and the refugee experience. That was scary enough, harsh enough, and everything like that. So I find it kind of, really interesting that maybe for you and your particular experience, that the war and the refugee experience must seems like a very distant thing. And instead, what can be foregrounded are these tall tales and ghost stories and curses and things like that, which I would have preferred actually growing up with. I think I would have been much less traumatized by hearing about ghost stories and hearing about the terrible things of the war and everything like that. Do you feel like your generation, especially growing up in Santa Ana, surrounded by a lot of Vietnamese people or close to a lot of Vietnamese people, do you think this issue of the war and the refugee experience is now for your generation something that's just beyond your personal experience? Like, is this history and it's not really a personal or emotional thing anymore?
And just to add to that too, your book kind of leaves out the Vietnam War, right? But still they're dealing with this trauma that happened. So
yeah, it's like you just cannot write a Vietnamese like diaspora story without talking about the Vietnam War or like touching upon it, right? And I reference it through the trauma that the mothers have. Like that trauma that's literally what I grew up with, watching my parents suffer, right? Trying to get over that. Like it's just so heavy. And I purposely really just wanted to write a contemporary story because, I did grow up in Santa Ana. Like it was a majority of my life. I would go to Asian Garden Mall. I would, yeah, I might watch my mother bargain.
shout outs to Phước Lộc Thọ.
Yeah, I would watch my mother bargain like with these women at the jewelry shops, like causing a scene over $30. Right, like that was like my childhood. I remember like TNK Food Market. And so for me, like I just really wanted to like bring something more contemporary to Little Saigon, which I don't think I've seen in a long time actually, in terms of like like a Vietnamese diaspora, like literature. So I really just wanted to like highlight that because a lot of the romance stories stems from like my friends and like how they try to seek love in their 20s and when they couldn't find that from their parents, right? And so that sort of like messiness and that just growing up with those women that I have known my entire life, and I really wanted to pay homage to that.
Are your parents still in the OC in like Santa Ana, Garden Grove, Westminster?
Yeah, they've never left that house. That house in Santa Ana I mentioned in the book is the house I reference. It's my parents' house. Yeah.
So have they read your book yet, Carolyn? And if they have, how have they reacted to it? Or even like how have they reacted to you writing a book?
My dad, so he doesn't really, my dad's a bit of a clown. Like he doesn't really like know, he's like that old school, he's like that really old school Vietnamese guy. He wears like the silk pajamas. He has a gold chain. He smokes 2 packs a day of off-brand cigarettes. I don't know where he gets it from. Like he's very old school Vietnamese, and he doesn't even. I think I like told him I was being published, and he thought I went to like Kinko's. You know what I'm saying? Like he doesn't quite understand it, and I don't think he ever will. But my mother, on the other hand, like my parents are separated, by the way. So my mother, like, it's interesting. It's more interesting for my mother because she left Saigon at 75 and she was studying English in college and she was never able to finish her English degree. And so for me to have this book come out, it's like full circle, right? And so she's like slowly reading through it right now. Awesome. And she's like really working through it. Yeah. So it's actually it's special.
Going back to that idea that Vietnamese people know how to cut you, whoa, you publish something at Kinko's? I think that's really brutal.
My dad's a clown. A complete clown.
No, was he clowning you, or did he just not get it that you had actually got a real book?
He didn't get it until he saw me in the Nguyen Viet newspaper.
Oh, the Viet language newspaper.
He was like shocked. Let me tell you, this man was shocked.
So that people like you make it to Paris by night, like the poet Bao Phi got to read at Paris by night. I thought, wow, that's amazing, right? Everybody now will know who he is. And now Nguyen Viet is the other venue to prove to Vietnamese reading people that this is real. So was your picture in the newspaper?
Well, I gathered my parents for a photo, and my parents haven't taken a photo together in like 20 plus years. So they didn't understand what was going on. And so when I I told him, oh, it's for the Vietnamese newspaper. My dad was like, okay. Like he didn't believe me, right? And then when it came out, like I think he was like in disbelief. And my mom had bought like 10 copies of the newspaper. She even like gave him one. So and I think then like he began to realize like the gravity of what's going on. But even now, like he does not mention it. Like he doesn't even know, like he has no idea what's going on. Yeah, he's like old school Vietnamese. Yes,
he probably like won't acknowledge it until your second book comes out and it's about like the father-daughter
relationship.
like,
Yes,
oh,
exactly.
That's me.
Father in the sequel, you know, the misfortunes of Vietnamese men or whatever.
Yeah.
But you know, for those people out in our audience who are not familiar with Vietnamese American culture, Paris by Night is basically the Vietnamese American version of Hollywood song and dance extravaganza. No one reads books in the Vietnamese American community. They watch Paris by Night instead, okay? And then Nguyen Viet is our version of the LA Times or the San Francisco Chronicle. So to be featured in there is a big deal, especially if you're a younger person. To impress upon your parents that their friends will be reading about their daughter in Vietnamese in the Nguyen Viet newspaper. So that's a huge accomplishment. Did you debut the book in Orange County? Did you have a book reading in Santa Ana or someplace close to it? And did your family come?
No, I had it in Los Angeles. So I had it in Echo Park at Stories. My parents did not come. My parents do not leave Santa Ana. They do not leave within the 17, like 20 miles within that area. Yeah, that radius is like their world. And they absolutely refuse to leave that area.
For sure. Maybe only to the 66 to get some roast pork from Samu or something, but not too far from there. But Carolyn, we want to, thank you so much for being on Accented Dialogues in Diaspora with us. Before we leave for the night, one question I wanted to ask you is, what is it that you wish readers will take away from your book?
I really want to stress like Vietnamese joy, you know, and I feel like that's like quite rare to see these days. And, you know, we hear so much about everything else. And I feel like Vietnamese people, Vietnamese women have to like always be sad. Our stories have to always be so sad. And that's not always the case. Like that's the point of all of this, right? We have such a diverse array of stories coming out now. And I think that's like, it's actually like really, really nice to see.
I will completely affirm that to our audience. To our audience, I'm Viet Thanh Nguyen, the co-host of Accented Dialogues in Diaspora with my other co-host, Philip Nguyen. We've been speaking with the debut novelist Carolyn Huynh about her very funny, very romantic, very accurate depiction of Vietnamese American culture. The novel is Fortunes of Jaded Women. Carolyn, it's been such a pleasure talking to you, and I'm inspired by the fact that we have a new generation of writers and creative people like yourself telling, you know, the stories that need to be told about the Vietnamese American community that are not defined purely by trauma and history and war and all that stuff, but is instead about Vietnamese American women and their daughters and the unfortunate men in their lives and all these other aspects of Vietnamese American culture that we who grew up in this community know so much about. Thank you so much and good luck with your novel.
Thank you so much.
Carolyn.